AudioGo presents The Great Debate, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of Right and Left by Yuval Levin, read for you by Mike Chamberlain. Preface. On its surface, American politics these days can seem impossibly complicated. We confront a bewildering array of public policy problems, each impenetrably convoluted in itself and largely disconnected from the others. Who could simultaneously understand the intricacies of our tax code, the inefficiencies of our entitlement system, the inadequacies of our transportation infrastructure, the moral challenges presented by the abortion debate, and the ins and outs of the dozens of other prominent public questions demanding our attention? I make my living as a combatant in these policy debates. I am the editor of a quarterly journal about domestic policy and a think tank scholar who studies healthcare, entitlement reform, the federal budget, and similarly wonkish fare. I have worked on these issues as a policy staffer at the White House under George W. Bush and as a member of the staffs of several Republican members of Congress. And in doing so, I have found that making sense of these debates requires more than an immersion in the technical details. It requires a sense of how the different policy dilemmas that confront our society relate to one another, and why they so frequently divide us as they do. The way they divide us, after all, is hardly arbitrary. It is not by coincidence that people who tend to agree with one another on one set of issues, say how to deal with the deficit, often also agree on others, like how to reform American education, that do not seem obviously connected. There are exceptions, to be sure, but conservatives and liberals, and therefore often Republicans and Democrats, fairly consistently find themselves on opposite sides of contentious debates on a very broad range of subjects, from economic policy to social policy to the environment, the culture, and countless other public questions. The political right and left often seem to represent genuinely distinct points of view, and our national life seems almost by design to bring to the surface questions that divide them. I have long been intrigued by the sources and nature of those distinct points of view. And since the thick of the fight is not always the best vantage point for understanding what moves our politics, the search for some answers at one point took me away from Washington for a time to pursue a PhD in political philosophy at the University of Chicago. In studying the work of the West's great political thinkers, I became persuaded that the complicated policy debates that take place on the surface of our politics are moved not just by partisan passions or economic interests, but by deeper questions that, perhaps ironically, can be much more accessible to average citizens. These debates pose moral and philosophical questions regarding what each of us takes to be true and important about human life, and how this influences our expectations of politics. We may not think about these deeper questions explicitly every time we approach a contemporary political issue, but how we answer such questions shapes the great political debates of our day. That such questions should underlie our political life, however, does not itself explain why the citizens of our republic should coalesce around two clearly discernible and fairly coherent sets of answers. Why, then, is there a left and a right in our politics? This book hopes to offer the beginning of an answer to that question. That beginning is both historical and philosophical, and so this book is too. It is historical in that it seeks to understand where we are by considering where we came from. And in our particular political tradition, seeking out where we came from often means beginning our search in the late 18th century, that extraordinary era of the American Revolution and the French Revolution that together helped to shape the modern world. It is philosophical because it contends that what we can learn from that extraordinary era is, above all, a way of thinking about the most basic and timeless dilemmas of society and politics. This book, therefore, looks at Anglo-American politics during the age of America's founding, a subject of justifiably unending fascination, from an unusual angle, and tries to expose some unfamiliar features of it. The historical and the philosophical, in this case, intersect not in the abstract, but in the real lives of two people whose thoughts and actions help define the right and the left at their origins. This book tells the stories of their lives and times, and carefully considers their ideas and arguments. Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine lived in an era defined by a seemingly interminable succession of intense political crises, and both men were deeply involved in a great many of them, both as thinkers and as actors. In the process, each laid out a vision of the world, and especially a way of thinking about political change. In some important ways, Burke and Paine laid out the beginnings of the right and the left, respectively. The implicit and often explicit debate between them, therefore, offers us a glimpse into the origins of our political divisions. This book is thus a case study in how ideas move history, and in where some of the key ideas that have moved and still move our history came from. To point to the historical and philosophical roots of our political debates is not to stand apart from or above those debates. On the contrary, I have been drawn to the questions that animate this book precisely because I have played a modest part in some political debates myself. I'm a conservative, and I would not pretend to leave my world view at the door while I explore the foundations of our political order. But a conservative must take an interest in his own society's traditions, and our political tradition has always contained both the left and the right, each passionately advancing its understanding of the common good. I am therefore a conservative who is deeply interested in understanding both the left and the right as they truly are, and I strive here to tell their stories in a way that both liberals and conservatives today might recognize as meaningful and true, and from which both might learn something about themselves and their political adversaries. The origins of the left-right divide, of course, are not the same as its current incarnation. The differences between today's political divisions and those of Burke and Paine's era are at least as fascinating and numerous as their similarities. I hope to encourage both sides of our political divide to reflect on the path we have traveled. What might we each learn from our, and our opponents' intellectual progenitors, and what crucial insights might we have forgotten with time but would do well to recall? Above all, though, I hope this story might help fellow citizens of any political persuasion approach American politics with greater understanding and confidence. I hope to help the readers see that, although many arguments that boil at the surface are technical and complicated, they are moved by deep, permanent questions that are not only important, but also awfully interesting. Introduction. Anyone tracing the pedigree of American political ideas must be struck by the importance and by the sheer eventfulness of the late 18th century. Between about 1770 and 1800, many of the crucial concepts, terms, divisions, and arguments that still define our political life seemed to burst into the world in fierce and fiery succession. This was the era of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and we have long since fallen into the comfortable habit of attributing the explosion of political philosophy and drama of that time to those monumental upheavals. The American Revolution, the first successful colonial revolt in history, gave birth to a creedal nation embodying the idealism of the Enlightenment, whereas the French Revolution launched in earnest the modern quest for social progress through unyielding political action guided by uncompromising philosophical principle. In these great crucibles of revolution was forged the frame of modern politics, or so the argument goes. There is, of course, much truth to this cliché, but it is a partial, or perhaps a second-hand truth. In fact, the late 18th century was the scene of a great Anglo-American debate about the meaning of modern liberalism, a debate that has since shaped the political life of Britain and America, and by now that of a great and growing portion of humanity beyond them. The American Revolution embodied that debate, and the French Revolution intensified it, but the debate preceded them both and has long outlasted them. The ideals of the American founding were championed by statesmen revolutionaries who disagreed among themselves about the practical significance of those ideals. The disagreements did not take long to surface and to break the politics of the new republic into distinct camps that in many ways have endured. The actual parties to the struggle in France, meanwhile, the Jacobins and Girondists, monarchists and aristocrats, have no real parallels in contemporary politics. But the parties to the intense Anglo-American debate about the French Revolution, a party of justice and a party of order, or a party of progress and a party of conservation, bear a plain paternal resemblance to the parties that now compose the politics of many liberal democracies, including our own. In both cases, the parties to the great debate of the late 18th century clearly prefigured key elements of the left-right divide of our time. The arguments between them had to do with much more than the particular promise and peril of the American or French revolutions, and they have lasted because they brought to the surface a disagreement within liberalism that has never lost its salience. There are no perfect representatives of the two major parties to the great debate of that age, but there may well be no better representatives than Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. Burke was an Irish-born English politician and writer, a man of intense opinions with an unrivaled gift for expressing them in political rhetoric. He was his era's most devoted and able defender of the inherited traditions of the English Constitution. A patient, gradual reformer of his country's institutions, he was among the first and surely the most adamant and effective critics of the radicalism of the French Revolution in English politics. Paine, an English-born immigrant to America, became one of the most eloquent and important voices championing the cause of independence for the colonies, and then, as revolution brewed in France, he became an influential advocate of the revolutionaries' cause as an essayist and activist in Paris and London. A master of the English language, Paine fervently believed in the potential of Enlightenment liberalism to advance the cause of justice and peace by uprooting corrupt and oppressive regimes and replacing them with governments answerable to the people. He was a brilliant and passionate advocate for liberty and equality. Each was both a man of ideas and a man of action, a man of powerful political rhetoric and of deep and principled commitment to a cause. Each also saw in the debates of the age far more than the particulars of the events that launched them. The two men knew each other, met several times, exchanged letters, and publicly answered one another's published writings. Their private and public dispute over the French Revolution has been called perhaps the most crucial ideological debate ever carried on in English. But their profound disagreement extends well beyond their direct confrontations. Each voiced a worldview deeply at odds with the other over some of the most important questions of liberal democratic political thought. While the capacious arguments of the time surely could not be fully captured in the debate between Burke and Paine, the important questions at stake can be far better understood by examining the two men's views with care. And yet the precise terms and subjects of their disagreement, especially as it relates to matters other than the French Revolution itself, remain to a surprising degree under-examined. This book seeks to examine Burke and Paine's disagreement and to learn from it about both their era's politics and ours. Using not only their dispute about the French Revolution, but also the two men's larger bodies of writing and correspondence, the book will explore the themes of the Burke-Paine dispute, taking apart each man's views of history, nature, society, reason, political institutions, freedom, equality, rights, and other key subjects, and seeking the premises informing each one's understanding of political life. It will argue that Burke and Paine each offers a coherent and, for the most part, internally consistent case about the character of society and politics, and that each man's case is greatly illuminated by contrasting it with the others. It will demonstrate that Burke's and Paine's diverse arguments are tied together especially by a disagreement about the authority of the given past in political life, and that there is much more to this disagreement than a staid and simple dispute between tradition and progress. Burke's reforming conservatism and Paine's restoring progressivism are both more complex and more coherent than they first appear, and a careful consideration of both can clarify the terms of our own debates, especially the fundamental dividing line of our politics. As Burke and Paine will show us, the line between progressives and conservatives really divides two kinds of liberals and two distinct visions of the liberal society. It may seem strange to seek philosophical arguments in the words of two men so deeply involved in day-to-day politics. We are not used to political actors who are also political theorists. Such actors were certainly a bit more common in Burke and Paine's era, when in both Britain and America we encounter some politicians who wrote and thought like philosophers, but they were still very much a rare breed even then. And because nearly all of Burke's and Paine's pamphlets, speeches, letters, and books were written with some immediate political purpose in mind, even as they made larger arguments, scholars of both men's views have battled over some very basic questions through the centuries. In Burke's case, the leading question has been whether he had a consistent set of views throughout his life, or whether the French Revolution transformed him somehow. As we will see, Burke spent the first 2 decades of his political career championing various sorts of reform, of the British government's finances, its treatment of religious minorities, its trade policy, and more. He spent much of this time pushing against the standing inertia of English politics. But after the Revolution in France, which he was concerned might be imported to Britain, Burke was above all a staunch defender of Britain's political traditions. He strenuously opposed all efforts to weaken the power of the monarch and the aristocracy, and warned against fundamental political reforms, like moves toward greater democratization, that might unmoor the nation from its long-standing traditions. He has sometimes been accused, therefore, of changing his most basic views and turning against his former co-partisans and friends. The charge could first be heard in his own lifetime, voiced by Paine among others, and has been repeated by some of Burke's biographers and interpreters ever since. But such a charge miscasts both Burke's earlier and later views, neglecting the arguments he offered both as a reformer and as a conserver of Britain's political tradition. Those arguments were always about finding a balance between stability and change, the quest that, as we will see, was at the core of Burke's ambitions. In the concluding words of his Reflections on the Revolution in France, Clearly foreseeing the coming charge of inconsistency, Burke described himself as one who wishes to preserve consistency, but who would preserve consistency by varying his means to secure the unity of his end, and, when the equipoise of the vessel in which he sails may be endangered by overloading it upon one side, is desirous of carrying the small weight of his reasons to that which may preserve its equipoise. This image of the man seeking to balance his ship, or to balance his country in a sea of troubles, against various threats to its cherished equipoise, is fitting, in light of Burke's varied causes and arguments throughout his eventful career. He was a reformer when some elements of the English Constitution threatened to suffocate the whole. He was a preserver when it seemed to him, as David Bromwich has put it, that revolution is the ultimate enemy of reform. Equipoise, for Burke, is not stagnation, but rather a way of thinking about change and reform, and about political life more generally. As we will see, it was a central metaphor of his political thought. Regarding Thomas Paine, meanwhile, the leading question that has divided scholars has run even deeper. Is Paine really a political thinker, or just a particularly passionate pamphleteer and agitator? While his rhetorical skills are unquestionable, Paine's seriousness, his contention with genuine political ideas, has sometimes been brought into doubt. Critics in his own time sought to dismiss him as a rabid sloganeer, or, as Burke himself put it, a man with not even a moderate portion of learning of any kind. And some scholars since then have repeated the charge that Paine brought more heat than light to the subjects he took up. But such accusations have always been tinged with a revealing snobbery. They have been made by political opponents who considered Paine's philosophy unserious, and who have therefore been inclined to see its champions, especially those who do not answer to the traditional description of the learned philosopher, as unserious as well. Certainly, Paine was not the erudite intellectual that Burke was. His formal education was minimal, and his engagement with the philosophical tradition of the West bore the telltale rough edges of the autodidact. One gets the sense that Paine took a sardonic pleasure in his peculiar, if plainly false, boast that in all his prolific years of writing, I neither read books nor studied other people's opinions. I thought for myself. Paine's friend Thomas Jefferson repeated a version of this backhanded praise when he noted that Paine always thought more than he read. Paine's writing is indeed remarkably, though far from entirely, devoid of explicit references to great thinkers of the past. Nor did he have the intense and extended exposure to practical politics that Burke could boast of. And yet, Paine's oversized role both in the American Revolution and in the English-speaking world's response to the French Revolution was no accident. Nor was it a mere matter of fortunate timing or purely a function of great writing. On the contrary, Paine's great rhetorical power came from his ability to bring even modestly educated readers into contact with profound philosophical questions, and to give those questions an immediacy and intensity that few political thinkers could match. Paine understood politics as moved by principles, and he thought that political systems had to answer to the right kinds of philosophical ideals, especially equality and liberty. However well established and grand they might be, however deep their roots might reach, all regimes had to be evaluated by how well they advanced these basic human goods. Thus, political principles and their instantiation in political actions are key to Paine's teaching, and present themselves far more prominently in the foreground of his writing than even in Burke's. In an 1806 letter, Paine wrote this about himself: My motive and object in all my political works, beginning with Common Sense, the first work I ever published, have been to rescue man from tyranny and false systems and false principles of government, and enable him to be free and establish government for himself. Paine sought for the theories and ideas underlying political life, and argued that only a government that answers to the right theories and ideas can make any claim to legitimacy. Precisely because Burke and Paine were both political thinkers and political actors, their dispute opens a window into the origins of our own political order. They help us to see how the kinds of arguments made in the heat of a policy debate relate to the kinds of arguments made in the calm of a philosopher's study. And they help us understand how the divisions on display in our everyday politics came to be. Burke was always stung by the notion that he and Paine should be understood together, complaining in one letter to his friend William Eliot of that bothersome Citizen Paine, who, they will have it, hunts with me in couples. But bothered though they might have been by one another, Burke and Paine may truly be best understood as counterparts. Like the two broad parties to our own political disputes, they continue to this day to hunt in couples. So let us join them on the hunt and see what we can learn from them about both their time and our own. Chapter 1. Two Lives in the Arena. On the evening of August 18, 1788, two of the fiercest combatants in the great political debates of the Age of Revolutions sat down together for a meal. Although they had given voice to deeply opposing political ideas for well over a decade, they had not yet quite grasped the degree of their profound dispute, and their time together, by all accounts, was pleasant and amicable. "I am just going to dine with the Duke of Portland in company with the great American Paine," Edmund Burke had written to a friend earlier that day. From the part Mr. Burke took in the American Revolution, Thomas Paine would later write, "It was natural that I should consider him a friend to mankind, and our acquaintance commenced on that ground." Their acquaintance would end on very different ground, and their disagreement, which was soon to explode into the open around the French Revolution, would not only help to define the politics of their age, but would also reverberate through the centuries and around the globe. It is tempting now to think of those dinner companions that summer evening as embodiments of the ideas we have come to identify with them, and perhaps to wonder how they could have tolerated one another's company, given their differences. But human beings are more than the sum of their opinions, and before we can consider what Burke and Paine stood for, we must discover who they were and get a flavor of the age in which they lived. Doing both will help us understand how men with such deep differences could at first encounter one another as fellow travelers of a sort, if not indeed as kindred spirits. Burke and Paine were both unusual figures in an unusual time. Each was a man of humble origins who became a celebrated luminary. Each was an outsider who transformed himself, by force of intellect and personality, into the great champion of a society in which he was not born. Each was a firebrand and master of political rhetoric. It was known as much for the force of his arguments as for the power of his words. And in every sense, Burke and Paine were men of their time, even if they disagreed vehemently about what their era represented and where its politics were headed. In our political imagination, the late 18th century is often shrouded in an almost mystical aura. It was an age teeming with towering political figures who managed somehow to be simultaneously statesmen and philosophers. Among his close acquaintances and friends, Thomas Paine could count George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and many other legends of the American founding generation. He thought of Benjamin Franklin as a kind of patron, and Franklin once described Paine as his adopted political son. Burke was well acquainted with Franklin too, having gotten to know him during Franklin's time as the representative of the American colonies in London. And Burke counted among his friends such leading lights of the British intellectual world as the great writer and moralist Samuel Johnson, the historian Edward Gibbon, the philosopher and economist Adam Smith, and essentially every prominent parliamentary and political figure of the day, from King George III on down. This profusion of philosophical and practical genius did not emerge all at once by accident. It arose in response to the profound social and political flux of the age. Even a century after England's glorious revolution had re-established a stable Protestant monarchy in London, religious tensions continued to boil just below the surface throughout the Anglo-American world. And even before the American and French revolutions shattered the reigning order of Europe, it was clear to all that the challenge posed to the continent's political traditions by Enlightenment ideas about freedom and equality, combined with the challenge posed to its aristocratic economic arrangements by the gradual emergence of an industrial manufacturing system, would yield deep and lasting changes on both sides of the Atlantic. The nature and character of those changes were at the heart of the debate in which Burke and Paine would take leading parts. But neither man was, by any means, a natural candidate for the part he turned out to play. A young Mr. Burke. Edmund Burke was born in Dublin, Ireland, most likely in January 1729. His father was a prominent, if never wealthy, attorney and a Protestant, and his mother was a Catholic from the Nagle family of County Cork. Such mixed marriages were not unheard of in Ireland in those days, but neither were they common. His Catholic wife meant that Burke's father, Richard, could never reach the pinnacle of Dublin society, and that the religious divisions, which translated as they still do to economic and political divisions, in Ireland, would never be far from Edmund's own view growing up. He was born the same year that Jonathan Swift described the miserable lot of Ireland's poor in his modest proposal. While Burke's family was always reasonably comfortable, he witnessed real poverty around him. At times, especially during extended visits with his mother's rural Catholic relatives, he even observed genuinely grinding deprivation of a degree barely imaginable to the English aristocrats he would come to know later in life. As was the custom in mixed Irish marriages of the time, Burke and his two brothers were raised in their father's Anglican faith, while their sister was raised a Catholic. Burke's early education was in a Quaker boarding school, where he showed an early aptitude for poetry and philosophy. In an era of often bitter divisions in both England and Ireland between the official Anglican Church, Catholicism, and the dissenting Protestant sects, such as the Quakers, Burke managed in his first 15 years to travel through all three circles. The experience of seeing differences of dogma made moot in practice by the bonds of family affection and neighborly respect were formative for him. It seemed to leave him with a lasting sense that life was more complicated in practice than in theory, and that this was a good thing. And his university education at Dublin's renowned Trinity College grounded this sense of the almost indescribable complexity of actual living communities in classical learning and a refined appreciation for philosophy and art. Although he would spend the great bulk of the rest of his life in England, these early Irish lessons, along with his distinctive Irish accent, never left Burke. They helped him always mark a difference between abstract political ideals and actual life as lived. He retained a sense of how accommodations built up slowly from reserves of trust, warm sentiment, and moderation could enable people to live together, even in the face of social tension, political oppression, and economic plight. His Irish upbringing and education also left Burke with a deep love of language, the written word in particular. Upon graduation from Trinity, he left for London, ostensibly to study law at his father's urging, though he abandoned his legal studies in short order to pursue his dream of joining the ranks of the great city's intellectuals by becoming a writer on large public questions. London was a hotbed of philosophical and political debates, most often carried on through pamphlets, lengthy opinion essays, most of which would today qualify as short books, published and sold very cheaply, often answering one another and seeking to ground in deeper principles an immediate question of policy. These pamphlets would swiftly make the rounds of London's burgeoning café culture and made for an exhilarating atmosphere of tense engagement with philosophy and politics. From his earliest published writing, a lengthy pamphlet called A Vindication of Natural Society, published in 1756, Burke tackled foundational questions of political life and revealed an inclination to recoil from potentially corrosive radicalism. The Vindication is a work of satire, lampooning the style of argument employed by Lord Bolingbroke, an important politician and thinker who had died a few years earlier, but whose final book, Letters on the Study and Use of History, had just been published posthumously. The book had been notable for its criticism of religion, including the official state religion. Bolingbroke had argued that all organized religions are essentially artificial and therefore unfounded, and that only a simple natural religion, or deism, that does not claim access to revealed truth, but merely expresses gratitude to God for the natural world, could be legitimate. He drew a sharp distinction between natural and artificial beliefs, championing the former in the name of rational science and rejecting the latter as groundless dogma. Burke, in his critical satire, emulated Bolingbroke's style and case, but applied it to politics, suggesting that all artificial social institutions should be abandoned. He sought to show where such ways of arguing would lead if they were allowed to proceed to their logical conclusions, suggesting that arguments intended to undermine religion by appealing to a simple notion of nature in opposition to traditional institutions could also undermine all political authority and social allegiance, dissolving the bonds that hold societies together. What is remarkable in Burke's first performance, wrote his great 19th century biographer John Morley, is his discernment of the important fact that behind the intellectual disturbances in the sphere of philosophy and the noisier agitations in the sphere of theology, there silently stalked a force that might shake the whole fabric of civil society itself. A caustic and simplistic skepticism of all traditional institutions, supposedly grounded in a scientific rationality that took nothing for granted, but in fact willfully ignored the true complexity of social life, seemed to Burke poorly suited for the study of society, and even dangerous when applied to it. Burke would warn of and contend with this force for the rest of his life. The Vindication had displayed Burke's early tendency to write about philosophically serious subjects with political and social implications, and yet to do so at some remove from daily politics. This was all the more evident the following year, 1757, when Burke published his most expressly theoretical work and his only real book, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. It was an insightful, if quirky work of aesthetics, the study of the human experience of beauty. Burke sought to explain the distinction between the beautiful, or well-formed, and the sublime, or compelling, as grounded in the difference between love and fear. It was a surprisingly original contribution to a long-running debate among British philosophical thinkers about the sources of human perception and experience, and it opens a door to the young Burke's emerging political sensibilities. Burke argues that human nature relies on emotional, not only rational, edification and instruction, an idea that would become crucial to his insistence that government must function in accordance with the forms and traditions of a society's life, and not only abstract principles of justice. The influence of reason in producing our passions is nothing near so extensive as it is commonly believed, Burke writes. We are moved by more than logic, and so politics must answer to more than cold arguments. Both of Burke's works enjoyed moderate success and helped him to make a name for himself in London's literary world. He was an early member of Samuel Johnson's lively circle, which included the famed painter Joshua Reynolds, Edward Gibbon, the actor David Garrick, the novelist Oliver Goldsmith, James Boswell, who later famously wrote a biography of Johnson, and other prominent intellectual figures of the era. And he thought of himself above all as a writer rather than a political thinker, though his writings always tended toward political and philosophical questions. The author and politician Horace Walpole ran across the still precocious Burke at a dinner party in 1761 and offered a telling description. Among the guests, Walpole wrote in his private diary, was a young Mr. Burke who wrote a book in the style of Lord Bolingbroke. That is much admired. He is a sensible man, but has not worn off his authorism yet, and thinks there is nothing so charming as writers, and to be one. He will know better one of these days. Burke would come to know better as he ventured into politics, which he did largely for practical reasons at first. In late 1761, now married and a father of one, he needed a reliable livelihood, and so put aside his writing ambitions. He took up a position as private secretary to William Gerard Hamilton, an ambitious member of Parliament who soon became the British government's chief secretary to Ireland, and took Burke with him. The post took Burke back to his birthplace for a time and gave him an even more direct view of the intense religious tensions that tore at Ireland's soul. In his many years in English politics, Burke would always be sensitive to being viewed as too immersed in the Irish question, given his roots, but he could never let go of it either. His religiously mixed family, combined with his experience at Hamilton's side, made him a devoted defender of the basic rights of Ireland's Catholics, often to his own political detriment. After 3 years in the post, Burke left Hamilton's service, and through the help of mutual acquaintances, became private secretary to the Marquess of Rockingham, the great Whig leader who would serve briefly as prime minister and would be Burke's foremost political patron and friend. Rockingham immediately grasped Burke's immense talent and value, his erudition, his prudence, and his considerable rhetorical skills. He brought Burke into the inner circle of Whig politics, and in 1765 arranged for him to be elected to a seat in the House of Commons, Burke's great arena for the next 3 decades. From that point until his death in 1797, Burke would be immersed in the political life of his country and would devote himself to seeing Britain through the staggering and seemingly endless succession of crises and other challenges of that period, taking passionate public views on the great questions of the day: Ireland's religious and political troubles, the American Revolution and its aftermath, Britain's management and mismanagement of India, contentious reforms of the British parliamentary and electoral system, the monumental challenge of the French Revolution, and the European War that followed. Though Burke would hold no prominent executive position and indeed would spend the great bulk of his time in Parliament in opposition, his voice would quickly become among the most prominent and recognizable in British politics, and his pen would prove crucial to the great events of the age. As a counselor to the Whig party's leaders, Burke established himself as a chief voice of the party, and indeed soon became the leading advocate for the place of political parties in British public life. In a 1770 pamphlet, Thoughts on the Causes of the Present Discontents, written in the context of a scandal involving King George III's excessive involvement in government appointments and public jobs, Burke argued that political parties were not, as many people insisted, factions each contending for its own particular advantage, but rather were bodies of men each united by a vision of the common good of the whole nation. Partisanship, he insisted, was not only unavoidable, but also beneficial, as it helped to organize politics into camps defined by different priorities about what was best for the country. This popular pamphlet, and others like it in that period, showed unmistakable early signs of Burke's distinctive political philosophy, as he argued for prudent statesmanship and an attention to the sentiments, and not just the material needs, of the people, and to the venerated status of social and political institutions. Political reform, he suggested, must take account of these, and proceed gradually and respectfully regarding them. The pamphlet also revealed Burke's immense rhetorical skill, which expressed itself not only in a talent for captivating epigrams, but also in a sustained and coherent vision of political life and society laid out with impressive clarity and consistency. As Burke later put it in describing the talents required of a statesman, this vision combined a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve. And it was always reinforced by powerful and memorable written words that overwhelmed the reader with images and ideas. Burke also devoted a great deal of his time and energy to parliamentary and financial reform during this period. Frequent scandals around revelations of public mismanagement and corruption were undermining the nation's faith in its government, and Burke was concerned that an excessive response from his fellow members of Parliament to the scandals could threaten the integrity of Britain's mixed regime. Wasteful spending on the monarchy itself, especially the king's enormous staff and costly residences, was a particular concern, and Burke moved to stem that concern by reorganizing how the system was financed. He also sought to simplify Britain's immensely complex criminal law, which, he believed, assigned vastly excessive punishments for petty crimes, and to soften the punishment of debtors. Burke was keenly aware that society was always changing, and its laws needed to change too. But in every case, he advanced gradual and incremental rather than radical or fundamental reforms, and he always called for respect for existing institutions and forms. Constructive change requires stability, so reformers always have to be careful. I advance to it with a tremor that shakes me to the inmost fiber of my frame, he told the House of Commons in reference to his financial reforms. I feel that I engage in a business the most completely adverse than can be imagined to the natural turn and temper of my own mind. No eager Democrat, Burke rejected the notion that a member of the Commons must simply express the views of those who sent him, even telling an audience of his own constituents in 1774 that he owed them his judgment rather than his obedience. But for all the passionate expression he gave to the cause of preserving Britain's cherished institutions, Burke, in these early years in Parliament, was, above all, a reformer of financial policy and trade policy, of laws restricting the freedom of Catholics and Protestant dissenters, and of the criminal law. He also opposed the slave trade as inhuman and unjust, and resisted the undue intervention of the Crown in politics. Burke approached the American crisis, which heated to a boil in the mid-1770s, with this mix of inclinations toward preservation and reform. As he saw it, the Tory administration of Lord North had acted imprudently in trying to pay Britain's war debts by levying new taxes on the Americans without consulting them. People who argued about whether Parliament had the right to tax the American colonies, the question essentially everyone on both sides of the debate took up, were focused on the wrong subject. Parliament certainly had that right, Burke suggested, because its legal prerogative to govern the empire was unquestionable. But having that right did not mean Parliament had to exercise it, or that the government was wise to do so. The government of human beings, he argued, is a matter not of applying cold rules and principles, but of tending to warm sentiments and attachments to produce the strongest and best unified community possible. Surely London could work with the Americans to yield greater revenues rather than commanding their assent. Politics ought to be adjusted not to human reasonings, but to human nature, of which the reason is but a part, and by no means the greatest part, Burke said. The Americans, he argued in his speech on conciliation with the colonies, had over time developed robust habits of freedom and an independent spirit, and if they were to be governed as Englishmen, some reasonable effort must be made to accommodate their character. In this way, Burke put himself at odds with the most passionate American advocates of independence, including Thomas Paine, by denying their most basic claims of rights and principles, claims he rejected not only as false in that instance, but also as inappropriate for political judgment in general. Burke certainly believed in the central importance of political rights, but he thought that rights could not be disconnected from obligations in society, and therefore could not quite be understood apart from the particular circumstances of particular societies in particular moments. The more radical liberals of his day treated politics as a kind of philosophical geometry, he thought, applying principles and postulates to come up with the right solution. But real societies did not work, or at least did not work well, that way. And yet he put himself on the radical side of the practical question, concluding finally that if North's administration could not govern the Americans prudently, it ought to set them free for the good of the empire. In these speeches, we begin to get a sense of the richness of Burke's understanding of society and politics. Especially evident is his understanding of how to properly manage political change to balance the desire for justice and the need for social stability, a subject that, as we will see, was often foremost on his mind. In the years that followed the American War, these views continued to drive Burke to restrain and resist abuses of government power. Government, he wrote, is deeply interested in everything which, even through the medium of some temporary uneasiness, may tend finally to compose the minds of the subjects and to conciliate their affections. Excessive and needlessly aggravating uses of power can undermine these affections, and this idea moved Burke to worry about the king's excessive involvement in politics in the early 1760s, the needless irritation of the Americans later in that decade and into the 1770s, and British abuses of the natives of India in the 1780s. Out of the latter concern, Burke in 1787 even launched a lengthy, albeit ultimately futile, impeachment effort against Warren Hastings, the chief British administrator of India. All of this made Burke a prominent reformer, though for reasons other than those of most of his fellows in that camp. He was never a radical modernizer, as some of his fellow Whigs were, but he worked with these more radical elements when he thought their efforts could counterbalance an abuse of power. But the abuse of power was not the only solvent of the sentiments essential to a strong and happy people. The corrosion of public feelings, mutual attachments, and basic human dignity that resulted from reducing politics to abstract rights and principles could be no less caustic. Indeed, as Burke had seen in his earliest published work, such corrosion could be far more dangerous in the long run because it tended to encourage a radical disposition toward politics. Politics was first and foremost about particular people living together, rather than about general rules put into effect. This emphasis caused Burke to oppose the sort of liberalism expounded by many of the radical reformers of his day. They argued in the parlance of natural rights drawn from reflections on an individualist state of nature, and sought to apply the principles of that approach directly to political life. "I do not enter into these metaphysical distinctions," Burke said in his speech on American taxation. "I hate the very sound of them." This way of thinking about politics made Burke a reformer of failing institutions who was wary of radical change, and a preserver of venerated traditions who was wary of the abuse of power. To someone familiar only with his final positions on particular questions, and not with the reasoning he offered to explain himself, Burke in the late 1780s, when Thomas Paine encountered him, would have been hard to read and easy to misunderstand. And Paine, thanks to his own unusual path to prominence, was himself not so easy to grasp. An ingenious, worthy young man. Thomas Paine was born in January 1737 in Thetford, in the south of England. His father, a corset maker by profession, was a Quaker, and his mother was an Anglican. Paine was baptized in his mother's church, his parents reasoning that this might open more doors for him in the future. But his father was the more religiously observant parent, and the young Thomas often accompanied him to the Quaker meeting house. Although as an adult Paine would criticize the austerity of the Quakers, once joking that if God had consulted the Quakers in the creation, then all the world's flowers would be gray, it is also clear that their stark moralism deeply shaped him. He had a lifelong ingrained sense that the laws of justice are clear and simple, that they embody a preference for the weak over the strong, and that there can be no excuse for disregarding them. Whereas Burke's mixed parentage left him with a sense of the complexity of society, Paine's experience seems to have left him thinking that religious disputes were ultimately pointless, and that it was morality, which he thought could be distinguished from religion, that truly mattered. "My religion is to do good," he later wrote. Paine's father always had steady work, but only enough to keep the family on the precipice of poverty. Intelligent and bookish, Paine was admitted to a grammar school at the age of 7. His parents scrimped to keep their only child in school, but they did not have enough to take him past the 5 years of schooling he received there. These years would be his only formal education, though Paine was a devoted autodidact from then on. After apprenticing in his father's craft, he spent a brief period in London, working in the trade by day and enjoying the city's literary café culture by night, and even made some extra money by serving for a few months as a privateer on a naval vessel in the 7 Years' War. Needing steadier work, he left London, first for Dover, and then to start his own small stay-making business in the town of Sandwich, in the southeast of England. Paine did not much enjoy his work, but it offered him a living, and he used every spare moment to read, especially books of poetry, history, and science. In 1759, he was married to Mary Lambert, who had been working as a maid in the town. Paine thus seemed to have begun his life's journey as a working-class Englishman. But in 1762, after the tragic death of his wife and child in childbirth, his world was turned upside down. Overcome with desperate grief, he abandoned his profession and his now empty home to become an excise officer, an itinerant collector of taxes on commodities like coffee, tea, and alcohol. The excise trade was notoriously corrupt. The collectors were paid very poorly and were expected to carry out the thankless and challenging task of confronting popular shopkeepers for back taxes and even combating smuggling and black market profiteering. Many of his fellow excise officers took bribes, and Paine himself was accused of wrongdoing when he rented a room from a shopkeeper who was under Paine's jurisdiction. The experience left Paine with an awareness of the potential for government corruption and for the abuse of workers, a sense that would stay with him. He did begin to rebuild his life in this work, finding friends among his colleagues, and in 1771 marrying a second time. But the difficult working conditions proved too much. In 1772, while working in East Sussex, Paine joined an effort launched by his fellow tax collectors to lobby Parliament for better pay and treatment. He had made a reputation for himself as an unusually well-read and well-spoken tax collector, and his fellow officers entrusted him to put their case in writing and press it before government officials. This was his first taste of the thrill of political action, and it led to his first political writing, a roughly 20-page pamphlet titled The Case of the Officers of Excise was received with rapt enthusiasm by his colleagues. Like his more famous later writings, this pamphlet contained a fascinating mix of careful lawyerly arguments, detailed facts and figures, and passages of passionate and at times powerfully beautiful rhetoric. It also clearly gave vent to Paine's own experience of poverty and even of grief at the loss of his first wife. Paine's response to the argument that the excise officers could find ways to make do with what the government paid them was thunderous. He who never was hungered may argue finely on the subjection of his appetite, and he who never was distressed may harangue as beautifully on the power of principle. But poverty, like grief, has an incurable deafness which never hears. The oration loses all its edge, and to be or not to be becomes the only question. Here was the voice that would move history. But it would not move Parliament on this occasion. In the winter of 1773 to 1774, Paine spent all his time, taking leave from his work, in London, distributing copies of his pamphlet and lobbying members of Parliament. The futile effort cost him his job, sent him deeply into debt, and ultimately became unbearable for his wife, who sought an end to their marriage. But Paine's disastrous monomania did not altogether ruin him. Bankrupt and living in London, he was introduced by a friend to Benjamin Franklin, then the representative of the American colonies in Britain. Franklin, ever the talent scout for his home team, was impressed with Paine's intelligence and drive, and advised him to seek a new start in America, providing him with a generous letter of introduction to ease his way. "The bearer," Franklin wrote, "is very well recommended to me as an ingenious, worthy young man." On November 30th, 1774, Paine arrived in Philadelphia. For him, as for so many before and after him, America offered a new beginning. He was eager to start not where his working-class roots had placed him by birth, but where his lengthy and deeply impressive philosophical and political self-education could enable him to operate. The reinvented Paine emerged very quickly into public prominence. Within weeks, he had found a job with Robert Aitken, a Philadelphia printer and publisher of the Pennsylvania Magazine, and by the spring of 1775, only half a year into his American journey, Paine was the magazine's editor and a regular voice in its pages. He wrote on a wide range of social and political subjects, from local scandals to international affairs, but always with a plain-spoken moralism intent on protecting the needy and weak. One article in particular, a powerful denunciation of the slave trade, gained him the attention of Benjamin Rush, a great physician and statesman and the unofficial organizer of Philadelphia's small but deeply impressive intellectual community. Rush brought Paine into the inner circle of the city's political and literary elites, where Paine's writings gained ever greater prominence. These early writings hint at both Paine's considerable rhetorical skills and his grasp of the reigning Enlightenment liberal views of his time. A devotion to individual rights, a theory of government as guardian of these rights, righteous rage at every violation of them, and an unbending passion for justice for the weak suffering under the boot of the strong. His sheer rhetorical skill sometimes overwhelms the reader, just as in Burke's writing. But where Burke's considerable faculty for expression is most often employed to convey the complexity of social and political life, Paine's most often conveys a simplicity, a sense that the just and right way forward can be discerned by a proper application of key principles, and that we are duty-bound to discern and to follow it. Paine's views, as they begin to emerge here, are not highly original, but they are fairly reliably representative of the Enlightenment liberal or radical views of his day. In these early years, as in his later, more prominent work, Paine spoke for many, but far more effectively than most. Paine's magazine mostly steered clear of the great and growing political question of the day, the prospect of a break with Britain. His publisher feared antagonizing Loyalist subscribers, and Paine himself was not initially sure where he stood on the question. But as events were giving shape to an American revolt, Paine came to believe that a reconciliation with Britain could no longer be had on just and honorable terms, and he began to employ his pen in the cause of independence. At first, he did so anonymously and outside the pages of the Pennsylvania magazine. His first effort, an imagined dialogue between two British generals, was published in the Pennsylvania Journal in January 1775, and argued that the British were not interested in reconciliation. He followed it with various essays, observations, and even poems intended to make the American case, at first gently and with an eye to possible rapprochement with Britain, but over time with increasing force and a growing emphasis on independence. In October 1775, he published a brief essay, A Serious Thought, which laid out British violations of the rights of individuals around their empire, including in America. The piece concluded, "When I reflect on these, I hesitate not for a moment to believe that the Almighty will finally separate America from Britain. Call it independence or what you will, if it is the cause of God and humanity, it will go on." As he published these short writings, Paine had begun to work on a more extended and sustained case for independence. Spurred on by the early battles between American and British forces and the appointment of George Washington to command the army, Paine sought a means of persuading the people to fight and, perhaps even more so, persuading the colonial elites to support the move for independence. By the concluding days of 1775, he had composed an extended pamphlet for that purpose, which he aimed to title Plain Truth. Paine's friend Rush, upon reading the draft, encouraged its quick publication and suggested an improvement to the title, Common Sense. The 50-page pamphlet was an all-out assault on the British crown, and indeed on the notion of hereditary monarchy and the practices and premises of British politics. It laid out, too, the beginnings of a political philosophy. Paine's opening description of the work for his readers, on the title page of the original printed pamphlet, describes it as taking up 4 subjects: the origin and design of government in general, with concise remarks on the English Constitution, monarchy and hereditary succession, thoughts on the present state of American affairs, and the presentability of America, with some miscellaneous reflections. The pamphlet begins by establishing some principles for distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate rule, that government exists to secure the freedom and security of its equal citizens, and that any government that fails to do so is not worthy of the name, regardless of its pedigree. Paine's case for independence is grounded in these stark and fundamental principles, and common sense asserts that reasoning from such principles and rights is the only proper way to approach politics. In straightforward language accessible to every reader, Paine lays out a lengthy and logical case against the authority of Britain to command the colonies, since the colonists are not represented in the parliament they answer to, against the legitimacy of Britain's own domestic political institutions, which give the king absolute power over the citizens his government is supposed to serve, and in favor of a republican government elected by the people and answerable to them. He concludes that, however strange it may appear to some, or however unwilling they may be to think so, matters not. But many strong and striking reasons may be given to show that nothing can settle our affairs so expeditiously as an open and determined declaration for independence. Paine's earlier efforts had certainly been noticed, but Common Sense was simply a sensation. Within a few weeks, it had spread around the colonies. Portions were reprinted in newspapers, and many tens of thousands of copies were sold. It reached its readers at a moment when many thoughtful colonists were wondering if their leaders had carelessly marched them into a disastrous blunder by taking on the world's most powerful military force. Was this conflict with England all a tax revolt by wealthy elites? Common Sense answered powerfully in the negative. This was a righteous cause and well worth the struggle. The pamphlet offered bold, fiery declarations for those already inclined to independence, as well as cool, logical arguments for those on the fence, and it seemed genuinely to persuade. By private letters which I have lately received from Virginia, George Washington wrote to his friend Joseph Reed in April 1776, I find that Common Sense is working a powerful change there in the minds of many men. In the months that followed, Paine quickly became the leader of the rhetorical struggle for independence. He published a series of letters responding to critics of Common Sense and helped draft a new constitution for Pennsylvania, seeking to put into practice the principles held out as the impetus for revolution: a representative government that treated its citizens as free and equal. Paine also contributed directly to the war effort, working as a secretary for several officers and traveling with the army to memorialize its efforts. The fall of 1776 was a very difficult time for Washington's army, and morale among the advocates of independence was extremely low. In an effort to lift the spirits of the fighting men and their supporters, Paine, while traveling with the army in New Jersey, penned an essay that came to be known as The American Crisis. The article would turn out to be the first of a line of crisis papers. The first paper opens with what may be Paine's most famous lines. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Paine would publish 16 crisis papers over the subsequent 7 years of war, each piece intended to address some particular exigency of the moment. Some of the papers were filled with facts and figures, others were simply pep talks for the troops, and yet others made large arguments in broad strokes about the illegitimacy of the British government's claim on the colonies. But all of the papers built on the arguments and worldview that Paine had laid out in Common Sense. Meanwhile, Paine was also actively involved in the administration of the war, serving as secretary to the Continental Congress's Committee on Foreign Affairs and later as the clerk of the Pennsylvania legislature. He also continued to publish essays and pamphlets on public questions, including calls for a stronger central government to advance the war effort and arguments for an end to slavery. At the end of the war, as compensation for his great service to the cause, the New York State Legislature gave Paine a farm in New Rochelle, which had been confiscated from a Loyalist family. There Paine lived until 1787, devoting himself largely to scientific pursuits and inventions. and most notably to a new design for an iron bridge with a single large arch that might traverse the width of a river without obstructing the passage of the large commercial vessels increasingly found in America and European river traffic. He seemed to put politics behind him, though, as it turned out, he could not keep away for long. This audiobook is continued on Disc 2.